Welcome to Study Session 3, Method of European Invasion, Diplomacy and Force. Introduction. In this session, you will learn how the hitherto existing trade and cordial relationships between the Africans and the Europeans changed in the 19th century to that of political and economic domination by the Europeans. Importantly, you will learn about the methods employed by the Europeans to gain the political and economic control of territories in Africa from the last quarter of the 19th century up to the middle of the 20th century in Africa. Europeans employed two main methods to invade Africa. These are diplomacy and force. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to analyze the diplomatic methods used by Europeans to penetrate peacefully into African territories. Describe the use of force by the Europeans to make African rulers surrender their sovereignty. Terminology. Diplomacy, the art of dealing with people in a sensitive and tactful way. Sovereignty, the authority of a state to govern itself in a particular geographical territory. Use of diplomatic methods. By diplomacy, I mean the tactics used by Europeans to make African rulers surrender their states and kingdoms to Europeans without the latter's use of force. Their tactics involve the signing of treaties by Europeans with African rulers. The treaties were generally referred to as treaties of commerce and friendship. In their ordinary meaning, the two signatories, the European countries and the African kingdoms involved, were, in the spirit of friendship, involved in the treaties to establish diplomatic relations involving exchange of political representatives, ambassadors. They were also to engage in bilateral commercial undertakings, in which case traders from the European signatories countries were to be allowed to trade with the African states or kingdoms with which the treaties had been signed. In most cases, the treaties often contained clauses on the abolition of the slave trade, the African signatories pledging to abolish the slave trade and undertaking to allow the European missionaries to preach Christian religion. Treaties implementation with African rulers. Most of the treaties signed with African rulers did not emanate from bilateral agreements between these rulers and European agents. The treaties were unilaterally drawn in Europe. African rulers were not always properly briefed to their contents. They were merely induced to put their marks on them to signify their acceptance of the treaties. Africans in most cases did not realize the implication of the document the Europeans induced them to sign. Europeans succeeded in many instances in deceiving African rulers to sign these unilaterally prepared treaties. Africans' response to treaties signing with Europeans. It is important to state that not always did Africans sign treaties with proper scrutiny. Some African rulers were tactful and courageous enough to refuse to sign unilaterally prepared documents until their content had been fully explained to them. When such situations arose, European agents might modify the content to please the rulers. European double standard in treaties signing with African chiefs. In some instances, two texts of a treaty might be prepared in order to please curious African rulers. Thus, there were often two different accounts of the same treaty. For instance, the treaty which Galerni, a French officer, signed with Sheikh Amadou of Ségou in 1980, two different texts of this treaty existed. The first, which was written in French and did not carry Amadou's signature or the seal of his empire, claimed that Sheikh Amadou had agreed to place the Nigerian basin passing through his territory under the exclusive protection of France. The use of force often followed diplomatic approach. The reason for this is that Europeans did not always initially possess sufficient men force African rulers to submission militarily. They therefore usually played for time, either to enable them muster enough force or get local allies from among Africans themselves. When force was employed, it was used against recalcitrant African rulers. Such rulers were those who refused to sign treaties and insisted asserting its political authority over the European traders, missionaries, or imperial agents in their territories. Force against recalcitrant African rulers. King Kosoko of Lagos refused to sign treaty with the British. King Kosoko told the British agents frankly that he did not want British friendship. The British responded by bombarding Lagos and forcing him out of the throne. They allied with Akintoye, his rival, who was installed as the puppet king, through whom they were able to establish their political presence in the island kingdom. He signed treaty with the British in 1851, and 10 years after, British annexed Lagos. Force against African rulers who dishonored treaties agreements. Force was also employed to deal with African rulers who had signed treaties with Europeans but had neither not taken the treaties seriously or refused to honor them after realizing the implication of their action. Many African chiefs fell into this category. Whenever and for whatever reason the Europeans used force to impose their political control on any African state, they used it decisively and successfully. Summary. In this study session, you learned that 1. Europeans used diplomacy and forces to impose their political control over African states and kingdoms. Treaty making with African chiefs was often the first European approach to acquire African territories. Diplomatic approach often failed because no African chief was willing to surrender his territory to foreigners easily. Failure of diplomacy resulted in the use of force. Europeans succeeded by force in imposing their control over many African states, except in Utopia. End of study session 3. Thanks for listening.